Men, if you're struggling with hormones and you're just not feeling your best, or if you're on TRT and you can't fully dial in, your provider probably has no idea what they're doing. Stay tuned because this is for you. So this is part 3 of my Men's Lab Panels 101 series. It's going to coincide with the article series. For those of you just joining, be sure to check out coverfitwell.com and Substack at coverfitwell for the full part 1, part 2, part 3 article series. Those articles will go a lot more in depth and have just a lot more nuance to what we're talking about here. And if you missed the first 2 videos from this series, be sure to check those out. Part 1 was just your basic tests. And then part 2, we discuss essential vitamins and minerals. So today we're going to move on to hormones, all things hormones. We have sex hormones, thyroid, adrenals, and this is where things get the most complicated and go the most awry for, in terms of providers doing things properly. I discussed in the first video a little bit about why that is in the first article and video. So be sure to check that out if you're curious as to why. But today we're going to break down. We got a lot of material to cover in this video. It's going to be a little longer than the first 2. It's a bit more comprehensive just because this subject is obviously highly nuanced and there's a lot of material to cover. So we are focused on what lab panels we absolutely want to check out, when, why the ones that you've probably been called for are completely wrong. Or I should say, not completely wrong, but either incomplete and or not the most accurate. So we're going to start with sex hormones, okay? Obviously, the first hormone on this list needs no introduction with men out there, hopefully at this point. We have testosterone, all right? So most of you out there who've been tested for testosterone are probably, you've probably been tested for total testosterone. And that's fine and well. We definitely need that marker, but that marker by itself doesn't really tell us much or everything we need to know. And the other thing is, we probably, you probably rather, your clinician is probably calling the, again, we could say wrong or we could say less accurate version of a total testosterone test. So if you just see on your lab panel testosterone total, okay, that's what's called the ECLIA. It's basically what's called an immunoassay. The full name is in the lab, is in the article rather. I'm not even going to bother trying to trip over my words and say it all. But the test itself, so the ECLIA panel, it can be accurate. Okay, it's the most accurate in the mid range. Okay, so if you're floating around, like a 500 to 700, testosterone level, which is, about average for most men, depending on your age and other factors. But if you're floating in kind of the sweet spot in the mid range of testosterone, ECLIA can be a good enough proxy. It often is off by 50 to 100 points. But when you're in the middle, right, that doesn't matter so much because we know that if especially if you're not symptomatic, that's the real key thing. If you're just doing wellness checkups and you're coming back around 600, 650, 700, then ECLIA for all intents and purposes is probably fine. However, the ECLIA testosterone total panel is not accurate on the margins, and this matters the most, obviously, for men who are or suspect they are hypogonadal. Okay, so if you suspect you have low testosterone, especially if you have symptoms, or if you're doing that ECLIA panel, you don't feel so great, and you're coming back in the 3 to 500 range, it is worth your time, and worth your time from then forward, especially, to get the LCMS /MS version. Again, acronym for long name in the lab article, but all you have to know is LCMS is what you must specifically specify and push because the physicians typically will not call it. Reasons for this: the ECLIA, frankly, is cheaper and faster, and apparently for most clinicians that's good enough. But when we're dealing with something as intricate as hormones and balancing hormones and hypogonadal symptoms, which is in my opinion, probably underdiagnosed in a lot of men these days in society. We should be as specific as possible. So you definitely want to, like I said, if you're symptomatic and or if you're on the margins or you suspect you are, just get the LCMS. Your insurance should still cover it if you're going through insurance. May take a little longer, up to about a week for the results, but it's well worth it. Now, total testosterone, like I mentioned previously, does not tell the whole story. Okay, so what is arguably, and not always, but oftentimes more important for symptoms is your free testosterone level. Okay, so free testosterone is basically the unbound or the active version of testosterone in your body. So it's what your body can use at any given time. And when you're low in free testosterone, that tends to, again, not always, produce more side effects or more symptoms rather of hypogonadal symptoms. So total testosterone is a small percentage of the free testosterone is a small percentage of the total testosterone in your body. So when we look at free testosterone as a percentage or as a ratio to your total testosterone, we want to see it at between 2 and 3% of total testosterone. If you're lower than that, especially if you're symptomatic and your number's not so great, that implies that hypogonadism is probable. Then we'll go through the rest of the test to find out why that might be. But point being is a total testosterone test, again, unless you're like sitting mid to high range and you feel great and you have no symptoms, total testosterone can be pretty useless for evaluating hypogonadism without free testosterone. Now, caveat to that test is the clinicians, the few who do give free testosterone, they give the LabCorp version of that test, which is you'll see testosterone free direct. Okay. And this one drives me even more crazy. The direct free testosterone test, you can Google it and you can look in the clinical guidelines, is not accurate for determining an accurate free testosterone level. It can be off somewhat substantially. It does not basically, we won't go into the specifics here, but all you need to know is that, again, clinical guidelines suggest that the direct free testosterone, which is basically an immunoassay, an ECLIA, is not accurate for free testosterone. So if you're going to bother doing a free testosterone test, and I'll say why I say if, since I said it's important in a minute here, you want to do the dialysis, okay, the serum dialysis test. This is the LCMS, gold standard of free testosterone. Again, many clinicians don't want to call that. Most insurance should cover it. If you can't get it or they won't call it for whatever reason, what you can do is you can take your total testosterone, your SHBG, which we'll talk about shortly, and your albumin from your CMP, your comprehensive metabolic panel. You can Google free testosterone calculator. I actually have a link to one in the article. And you can what's called calculate your free testosterone level based on these three values, okay? And that calculation is, again, clinical guidelines suggest that is your default if for some reason a, dialysis LCMS test is not able to be utilized. And so what we'll want to do there basically is we'll take that calculation. That calculation, in my experience, I have done like both at the same time. So I've had the gold standard and then I've done the calculation on the same lab. They're really neck and neck. They might fluctuate by like a few points, but nothing substantial enough to truly change an interpretation. So if your provider won't call or didn't call or called the wrong free testosterone panel, as long as you have, which is why I always get SHBG, and that should be standard. Again, we'll talk about that. And you typically will always have an albumin level from your CMP. You can calculate it and you can get accurate results that way. All right, so moving on, we're going to go to estradiol. Most people might just know this, especially men, they just know this as estrogen. There's actually 3 different estrogens. Estradiol, or E2, is the one relevant to men. And we want to test estradiol as well. Now, again, a lot of clinicians won't do it. most, if you're running hormone protocols or if you suspect you need to run a hormone protocol, will run it. They'll manage it wrong, which is another video for another day. But estradiol is definitely something you want to see. Most people don't know, or maybe they know, but just to clarify, estradiol is a byproduct of testosterone itself. So we discussed in the first video about cholesterol, how it's the first step in the hormone conversions down the chain. And testosterone actually metabolizes, actually converts down the chain. Its next step is estradiol. So through a process of what's called aromatization. Okay, so estradiol is relevant, and I think most guys know that estradiol, especially as a ratio, which is important to know, to your testosterone level, your total testosterone level, is a very important marker. Again, another video, another day, but most guys will think estradiol, not good, get it as low as possible. That's not a good strategy either. Low estradiol symptoms can be as bad or worse than high estradiol symptoms. The male body does need estradiol. It's extremely important. It's neuroprotective, cardioprotective, aids in keeping your bones healthy. So it also actually has a very prominent function in sexual function in men. So you need it, but it's a tight range. And so point being is we want estradiol with these. Now, for all three of these, again, caveat is just because your lab test comes back, in range, quote unquote, don't assume that that means that you're anywhere near optimal. And this matters a ton with testosterone and estradiol in particular. So, men's hormone levels are being crushed by environmental factors. We're not totally sure why. A lot of it suggests it might be the microplastics, the pollutants and microplastics in the water, the processed foods we eat, the lifestyles, the screens, the disruption of circadian rhythm. There's a lot of reasons as to why that probably is the case. But nonetheless, male testosterone levels are declining. And what the lab does, we talked about in the previous video in part 2, how lab reference ranges are just a snapshot of the average ranges of the total population, and they're not stratified by age. So this becomes very important in particular to testosterone level, because I think most people would understand that an 18-year-old should have, 2 to 3 times the testosterone level of an 80-year-old. But in those reference ranges, that's not accounted for. The other thing that I mentioned in part 2 is that the reference ranges, they're reflecting a society with a 40% obesity rate. We're depressed, we're unhappy, right? That's probably, if I'm on the bottom end of that reference range, if I'm still normal, but I'm on the low end, that doesn't really say anything, especially if I'm a younger guy and I'm doing everything right with lifestyle factors, eating, sleeping, training. So all this to say, get a provider who really knows what they're doing, because you could have a normal number, which men often do, and the provider, I got told by 6 different providers, your levels are fine, when I was clearly symptomatic, just because they were in range. And so, we always want to make sure these things all matter in relation to one another. It's not just about a total number. It's about the way that these hormones all relate to each other. Okay. So when we're evaluating these things, understand that if you're a younger guy, if you're an active guy, and your testosterone is, really anywhere less than I would say 600, 600, depending on who you are. But, if you're a younger guy and you're doing everything right and you can't get a 600 or more testosterone level, something's probably not optimized. And so that's why all of this matters together. But just understand, and, it's the same thing with the estradiol level. Like, don't just assume, I had a low E2 level because I was running low on testosterone, free testosterone, and estradiol from some health issues that I was dealing with. And again, I was in range, but I was nowhere near optimal, and I didn't feel well. So very important to understand. Don't just take any old clinician's word for it. All clinicians have their biases. People who are pro hormone replacement therapy have their biases. You really need someone who is as unbiased as they can be and can look at this from a nuanced perspective, which is increasingly few and far between in our society. This is purposefully why I'm doing this video. Next, okay, so before we move on, very important, estradiol, E2. Again, never seen a clinician call this right, literally ever. Even TRT providers, they always call for the standard estradiol panel. Okay, so you'll just see estradiol. This is effectively an ECLIA panel. Again, clinical guidelines, again, you can go read them. This is not an accurate test in males. This is not an accurate test in males. It typically will grossly overestimate estradiol levels. It's for females. Okay, why? They have much more in their body, so they don't need as precise of a measurement in order to determine a fairly accurate level. Whereas men, because we don't have a lot, you need to get what's called a sensitive E2 panel. It's very important that you specify that. I have tested both of these, okay, on the same labs. When I called 10 labs for myself when I got put out by various providers, and I was trying to get to the bottom of things. And when I called my own labs, at one point I called a sensitive and a standard estradiol panel just to see the difference. And my standard estradiol panel was almost double. I was running, like I said, low on E2. My standard panel was almost double that value. If my standard panel had been the correct value, I would have been in perfectly optimal range. But nonetheless, I wasn't, and so we have to use a sensitive panel. Very important. Okay, so testosterone total, LCMS, testosterone free, either dialysis if possible, or calculate it. Make sure you get an SHBG. Estradiol sensitive. All right, so moving on here, we are going to talk about prolactin here. All right, so prolactin is one, again, not often checked in males. Prolactin is, if we break down the word prolactin, it is literally the hormone that causes females to, and sometimes in very unfortunate and more rare circumstances, men to lactate, okay? It is a hormone that is controlled and released by the pituitary. And basically you could think of, for simplification, prolactin is the antithesis of, people probably are familiar with the neurotransmitter. Prolactin is the kind of inverse antithesis of dopamine. Okay, so effectively, when dopamine D2 specifically in the hypothalamus is low, let's say, that's a kind of a crude way, but when there's a problem with dopamine, a more specific way to say this is prolactin will be elevated when there is a problem with dopamine release controlling the suppression of prolactin. So that dopamine release is what regulates the level of prolactin. And in a man's body, we have prolactin, but we have very small amounts, and really any elevation, we're quite sensitive to it. We tend to be sensitive to it. Any elevation in this case is not good. So the reason I like prolactin levels is because it can tell us a lot about, for example, there's data to suspect that, you know, if men, for example, are going to initiate hormone replacement protocol, everyone's afraid of, am I going to get, you know, male breast development? So that issue can be tied to estradiol, but also prolactin, and these they can rise and fall in tandem. So I like prolactin always as a baseline for men, especially if they're dealing with things like low libido, low mood, erectile dysfunction, low motivation in general. Estradiol won't always tell a whole story. We'll often blame it without looking at prolactin. And what you'll see with prolactin is it can be elevated in certain circumstances. So probably the number one reason you'd have an elevated prolactin level could be anywhere from moderate to mild to pretty moderate, depending on the medication, is medications. So we're talking about, in particular, probably the worst offenders, antipsychotics. They can elevate the prolactin level quite robustly. The opiates as well, people who take opiates, especially long term. SSRIs can, not always, but SSRI antidepressants can. It's usually more mild, but they certainly can. And then there's lifestyle things. So if you didn't sleep well the night before your lab test, if you're stressed, if you've ejaculated in the last few hours, all of these things, there will be a transient increase in prolactin. Prolactin is actually what it gets released after you ejaculate, and it's what makes you not want to go again so fast. But I always look at prolactin because it tells us a lot about, highly elevated prolactin levels, moderate to severely elevated prolactin levels, will decrease testosterone levels. So again, when I'm looking into testosterone, I got to look at what are the potential causes of this to determine what to do about this. If there's a problem with prolactin, so anything I just named, these are all either drugs or lifestyle factors that are, causing this increase. We can remove those if possible, and we can normalize it. Now, there is an instance, it's a bit more rare, but it's not as rare as people think. You can also have what's called a prolactinoma, which is a small, benign, okay, so non-cancerous tumor on the pituitary. And that will literally stop the pituitary from the dopamine release to regulate those prolactin levels. Now, and usually in these cases, but not always, usually the prolactin level will be quite elevated. Okay, so for some people, they'll see it into the hundreds when I think the typical range caps around 20 in the US. And so usually, if you test it and it's high, providers will know at that point you send somebody out for an MRI to see if there's an actual, prolactinoma, if there's a tumor on the pituitary. And the good news is if that's the case, sometimes it could be operated on, but it's not, you wouldn't really want to opt to do that if you didn't have to. There's medication that you could take that will reliably get it back to normal. And in some cases, even depending on your specific case, if you had such a thing, the medication, if administered properly, often not done so, could even shrink it and get you back to normal, so you're not on the medication forever. But prolactin, nonetheless, very important. A lot of symptoms of high prolactin, even if testosterone is normal, can look like low testosterone. Okay, so I always like to have a proxy for this, again, especially in men with symptoms and or men going on or starting TRT, because again, a lot of men are afraid. Breast development, everyone knows about the dreaded gynecomastia. That is typically something that you've kind of had since puberty that's kind of being exposed, so to speak. But nonetheless, that can be influenced by not just estradiol, which most people know, but prolactin potentially as well. Okay. So moving on, we'll go to SHBG. I discussed SHBG before. SHBG stands for sex hormone binding globulin. SHBG is basically a protein. It's actually produced in the liver. So it's not technically a sex hormone, but it regulates sex hormones. SHBG is effectively what binds to testosterone so that only, we talked about that 2 to 3% of the testosterone in your body is free. So when we're looking into SHBG levels, again, important we get that marker, especially if we're going to calculate free T. But also, again, think of SHBG and free T as inversely related, typically, not always, but typically. So very common scenario you'll see, normal-ish or low normal total T, low free T, high SHBG. Very common thing you'll see. What's going on there? Basically, that elevated SHBG level is binding up all of the testosterone that your body can use freely, and you don't have enough in circulation. Conversely, when SHBG is low, again, not always, but free testosterone will tend to be higher. SHBG is just like most other things here. It's a range. People think, well, I'll just keep it as low as possible. And you can't totally do that. Some of it is just genetics and whatnot. Diet can affect it. Again, another topic for another day, but diets can affect it. Low carbohydrate diets in particular will jack it up. But most people will think, well, I just want to keep mine, nice and low then. And even though you really can't get it subclinical ranges on your own, just for theory's sake, that's not a great idea, because if I see low SHBG, like clinically low levels, that can mean there's a problem with the liver itself, could be a thyroid problem, etc. So again, we're talking about a range, and most people who are healthy will fall in the mid-range. The other thing about SHBG is that, so in addition to, we talk about it binding up this free testosterone, it's very, very important to understand that SHBG, if you are going to initiate a hormone replacement, a TRT protocol, you need an SHBG level in order to determine, and again, not a hard and fast rule, but can be helpful in determining frequency. Now, a lot of people, including myself or the school of thought, that the more frequent you can, despite your SHBG level, the better. However, that's not always possible for whatever reasons for people. So, if I see, and how this applies, for example, is if I see a very high SHBG level, those guys can tend to get away with dosing a little less frequently. Nothing less than once a week, and once a week is not good really at all. Some guys I would do at least twice a week, but they can get away with less. So let's say twice a week minimum. Um, for guys who are lower in SHBG, they're going to want to inject more frequently. So, if we're saying twice a week minimum, probably 3 times a week, maybe every other day. And there's a lot of argument now from people who are experts in this field, as well as myself, just from my own experience. The more frequently you can dose, even if that's daily, the better. There's a lot of reasons, another video, but SHBG, very, very important. Don't ever get a testosterone test without it because you won't have enough information, period. Last one of the sex hormones we're going to talk about, LH or luteinizing hormone, and FSH or follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so I say here when hypogonadism is suspected. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, they are hormones that think of them as signals from the pituitary that tell the testes to make testosterone and sperm. So luteinizing hormone will be primarily responsible for testosterone, follicle stimulating hormone primarily for sperm. When hypogonadism is suspected, so when you have symptoms and you're evaluating, right, or you just suspect it, we definitely want an LH and FSH, and you'll often not see this called. Why do we want that? Well, when LH and or FSH is high, running high or high normal, and we see low testosterone values with symptoms, for example, what that suggests is what's called primary hypogonadism, which means failure of the testicles. Okay, so you can have what's called primary, which is testicular failure, or secondary, which is pituitary failure. Primary hypogonadism is it can be caused by a multitude of things. Very commonly, and this was the case with me when I was dealing with some health issues. It can be caused by what's called a varicocele, which is effectively a varicose vein in the scrotum. It will cut off blood supply to the testicle. Testicle, if it's bad enough, will shrink. Testosterone goes down. Sperm count can be affected. Sometimes getting this repaired through surgery can fix it. Sometimes not, depending on how bad and how long it's gone on. But the point is if with an LH and an FSH level, if they're elevated, I can see this, okay? And that's important because if the cause can be fixed and you're younger, right, and if there are fertility concerns, right, TRT is very safe, perfectly safe and healthy when administered properly. But if you're younger, if there are fertility concerns, it's for life. It can obviously be a big decision. So if there's something reversible, we have to know. Conversely, if we see LH and or FSH low or low normal, and we see these low testosterone values and symptoms, always important, this would suggest that we are looking at what's called secondary, okay, or like I said, pituitary hypogonadism as a result of pituitary failure. So what that means is effectively that pituitary is not sending the signal to the testicles. Now, this can also be for a multitude of reasons. Some we just don't fully understand. I've seen evidence to suggest that sleep apnea, which is fairly common and more common than people think, especially as you age and or if you're overweight, sleep apnea can actually drive up that, sleep apnea can actually lower, right? So as a result of not getting that restful sleep, your pituitary just stops sending that signal. There are, again, we don't fully know all the reasons for pituitary failure, right? It's kind of the mysteries of the brain. But nonetheless, if I see secondary and there's things like sleep apnea, for example, that could be intervened with, it's good to know that. And it's good to know anyway, are you failing because of the pituitary, because of the testicles, right? More data is always better, especially when we might be able to intervene if possible. Okay, so when evaluating for symptoms of low T, LH and FSH not optional. All right. Let's move on here to thyroid. So most people, most adults have been tested at one point or another for their TSH, okay, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Again, think of this as the signal from the pituitary to tell the thyroid, which is an organ right here in the neck, your primary metabolic organ in the body, to make, and we'll get to this in a second, T3 and T4. TSH, this is akin to just having total T. It doesn't tell us much on its own. especially if you're symptomatic. And understand that symptoms of hypothyroidism and symptoms of hypogonadism can look virtually the same in men. Okay, weight gain, low libido, low energy, etc. So we want to make sure when we're again evaluating these things that we evaluate a decent thyroid workup as well. And again, all of this is really the bare minimum that you should be looking at, and you won't get this from providers. And there's far more tests that we could call for. Really comprehensive providers will call somewhere around 70 tests just to see you for hormone replacement therapy. But nonetheless, we want a thyroid panel. The other thing is we have to determine if it is hypogonadism or hypothyroidism, because if you have actual hypothyroidism and you go and you put TRT in the body, you can end up feeling worse. And vice versa. If this would be a little less prominent. People don't just give out thyroid hormones without the labs to match. I don't know why we'll do it with testosterone, but you know, vice versa. You don't want to treat a thyroid problem if it's actually testosterone that's the problem. So we need to look at all these things together again and how they relate. So TSH you've probably had. Again, doesn't tell you much on its own. You can have a perfect TSH level and still have other problems, which we'll talk about in a second here. And then even when we talk about TSH, the range in the US is typically around 0.5 to 4.5, but it's well known even in endocrinology that really anything above about a 2.5 is suspicious in itself, especially if there's symptoms. If you're young and you're metabolically healthy, especially, you should have a thyroid, between 0.5 to 2-ish, right? And if you're elevated to any degree, these other tests become especially valuable. Hypothyroidism is what we're talking about here. Hyperthyroidism, which would be overactive thyroid, so hypo, underactive, hyper, overactive, far less common and potentially more immediately serious. Again, those labs typically will be pretty glaring. So for the sake of this, we're talking about hypothyroidism, and because it's far more common. Hyperthyroidism being far more rare. So we have free T3 and free T4. These are both my non-optional. So if you gave me like non-optional, I would say TSH, free T3, free T4. T3 and T4, you have total T3 and T4, and you have free T3 and free T4, just like free testosterone, but even more importantly so in this case, free T3 and free T4 are the two active thyroid hormones. So once the TSH sends the signal, the thyroid makes T4, which converts downstream to T3, and that's what's utilized in the body. You have a total and a free. The free is what's actually active and being used. Total tests are really only valuable in examining like other thyroid workups, and if you're on thyroid replacement therapy, they can become accurate. But for just evaluating, if you're suspecting a problem or if you're just doing routine labs, typically we can do TSH, free T3, free T4. We'll get to the antibodies in a second, but we definitely want to see those. Some providers will at least call for free T4. Their reasoning being, well, if I call for free T4 and TSH and they're both normal, then because free T4 converts to free T3, I can just assume free T3 is normal. But that's the same thing as saying like, well, if I call for testosterone, it converts to estradiol, I can assume estradiol is normal. Like that's not how the conversion process in the body works. You need both. And free T3, because it's the metabolically, active of those hormones, is oftentimes really neglected and as or more important in many cases. So you need all three of these, TSH, free T3, free T4, in order to get an accurate reading of what's going on here. Those levels can be, again, they can be, low or so. If you look at hypothyroidism, you'll see typically elevated TSH, low free T3 and or free T4, but they can also just be suboptimal. Again, they could be in range, but not optimized, and you could have a subclinical hypothyroid. Now, if any of those tests, or you're just having symptoms, if any of these tests don't look great and or their symptoms, and I mean anything but optimal, then we would do what's called a TPO or TG antibodies workup. So TPO and TG antibodies are effectively markers for Hashimoto's and autoimmune causes of hypothyroid, right? So when you see elevated antibodies, that will suggest there's autoimmune hypothyroid present. And then usually in that case, not always though, because you can see antibodies years before your actual thyroid tanks in some instances. But if you see antibodies and you're having symptoms, pretty clear hypothyroidism. We can also call what's called a reverse T3. Again, can be useful. We're not going to go deep into that here. I said total T3 and T4 can have use when doing more extensive workups. And then you can check trace minerals like iodine. You do that through a urine test. Selenium can also be important. Obviously, you just want to make sure all these are. Your iron status is very, very important to your thyroid. So again, if there's anything less than optimal markers and or function, and you feel anything less than optimal, you're going to want to do some of these workups. And at the very least, in addition to these TSH, free T3, free T4, you're going to have to look at antibodies. Most providers, if they call the first three and they're awry in their symptoms, they know to call antibodies. But not always, and it's worth mentioning. And that's why I say these are follow-up tests. If you've never had it done, I would just call TSH, free T3 and T4, and TPO and TG antibodies right off the bat, and that'll tell you most or all of what you need to know. Last category we're going to go into here is the adrenal glands, okay? So your adrenal hormones. So you can think of these as, and again, the first two on this list, right, the DHEA sulfate and the pregnenolone sulfate, these are going to be made by technically the adrenals, and pregnenolone especially is a tricky one. But they have a lot of activity as what's called neurosteroids in the brain, again, especially pregnenolone. We'll get to that in a second. But for DHEA sulfate, so DHEA is most people might be familiar. There's a metabolic byproduct called the sulfate version. That's what we actually test for. That metabolite is more accurate in the blood. But that we use it as a proxy for DHEA. DHEA is an adrenal hormone that rises during puberty, peaks in young adulthood, and then drops off anyway throughout the course of life, much like testosterone does. DHEA is in that conversion process down, is the precursor to your androgens, your testosterone, and your estrogen. So very important to make sure that pathway is backfilled, so to speak, especially if you're symptomatic. Low DHEA can sometimes look like some symptoms of low T, low energy, low mood, low libido, things like that. So we want to make sure, again, that when we're looking at this, that we're looking at everything, make sure DHEA is in range, especially if we're going to start a hormone replacement protocol. We want to make sure it's in range because testosterone won't work optimally without it. And it does decrease with age. So if you're aging, if you're older, definitely something to look at, because replacing it in these instances, if necessary, can be very powerful for some men. We go to pregnenolone sulfate. Again, pregnenolone, there's a metabolite called the sulfated version that is going to have a better half-life as a blood marker for pregnenolone. I could say a ton about pregnenolone, but I'm not going to belabor it. I actually did 2 videos, pregnenolone 101 and 102. Check those out if you haven't. I really break down a lot about pregnenolone in there. How important it is for brain function, cognitive function, memory, anxiety, sleep, huge for those things, mood overall, testosterone not jacking you up if you're going to take testosterone exogenously, not getting into that revved up sympathetic, I can't sleep state. Pregnenolone, as you'll hear in that video, major actions at the GABA A receptor via its conversion to progesterone and allopregnanolone. Again, not going to belabor that here, but just know that pregnenolone is probably the most fascinating hormone in the body. It is the one step, so they have that cholesterol, and then that converts immediately downstream to pregnenolone. Pregnenolone then splits, and it goes either toward progesterone, down to allopregnanolone, and cortisol is actually in that same chain, or it goes over to DHEA. which we talked about goes to your androgens and your estrogens. So pregnenolone is often referred to as the mother of all hormones, and for good reason. It can be life-changing for people that need it. It is almost never tested for. In that video, I discuss how to test for it, because if you test for it, the reference range, there really are no reference ranges. Clinicians don't really know what they're looking at. They don't know how to use it. They don't know how to supplement. There's really only a few people out there who do. But it was life-changing for myself. That's why I made a whole video, so you can check that out. But just understand pregnenolone, very, very powerful neurosteroid. So we want to make sure these adrenal, these kind of backfilled pathways, these adrenal pathways are full, are filled if we are looking at symptoms of hormones and or testosterone replacement therapy. Last one we're going to touch on here is cortisol, AM cortisol, so morning cortisol test. I say optional here for cortisol because cortisol in men is typically going to be a secondary issue. So again, if you have a low testosterone level, you've probably been running on just cortisol. If you're not eating enough, right? A lot of people, even men, more common with women that I've seen, but men too. If you're underfed, if you're overtrained, if you're overstressed out, if you're getting poor sleep, all these things can potentially affect your cortisol. Again, we often talk about it going too high. It can also be too low. Too low is a lot more rare and will suggest that some kind of follow-up testing needs to be done. But I usually, what I'll do is kind of like we talked about in the first video, I'll do cortisol the same way I'll do a lipid panel, where once somebody's optimized with their lifestyle factors and we know everything else is optimized, I'll do it later as kind of a follow-up, especially if there's still some residual issues or morning activation, anxiety, poor sleep, etc. It can become more useful then. But in men, it's definitely different with women. That's a different thing. But in men, cortisol tends to be more of a secondary or downstream issue. So sometimes I will call it if the person just tells me flat out they wake up in fight or flight, or they have brain fog in the morning, or they're overly stressed out. Then it's good to look at. And there are strategies that, just aside from optimizing all this is the main thing, but there are strategies to use to bring that down. But the other reason I don't necessarily call it off the bat, and as I kind of take it with a grain of salt, is that the gold standard for cortisol testing is really salivary 24-hour testing. So you're actually going to get a more accurate level through the saliva, and you have to measure it at multiple points throughout the day in order to really know what's happening with it. So AM cortisol can be a proxy for things, but not always necessary. So that pretty much covers the hormones portion. Again, there's a lot more we could go into. The article does get a bit more specific on these things. And if you haven't checked out the pregnenolone video, a lot of that information is in the article, but also the video really breaks down some things about pregnenolone and some ways that it really changed my life. So be sure to check those out. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. There's a lot more like this. Any questions anyone has, I'm always active in the comments. Again, check out the article series that goes with this, covertfitwell.com, Substack at covertfitwell. And if you are interested in coaching, you can book a free consult with me for any of these things, whether it's pain-free fitness, integrative nutrition, hormones and TRT, total optimization wellness. You can book a free consult with me on my website, covertfitwell.com. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.